I am so grateful that we have these folks here to help us understand something that's beyond my understanding, to have them bring their knowledge to this conversation. And that's really what this is. It is a conversation. Each of these men, I will share who they are in just a moment, but they will be sharing a little bit about what they know, and then they're just going to have a conversation with one another. And I have found that that has been some of the most enlightening, insightful things to eavesdrop on. So we are all eavesdroppers today. So we do, though, want to answer any questions that you might have. And so to that end, if you have a question throughout the program, I invite you to write it down on the cards that are on your tables. You can write more than one question. You can just have a string of them. We will collect them when it comes time for Q&A and sort through and trying to answer as many questions as we can. So that's how we'll be doing that after this conversation. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you all Dr. Carl Martin, PhD. He's an emeritus professor of American literature at Point Loma Nazarene University, where he taught for 27. Whoops. You are so wise for only 27 years. My goodness. He taught for 27 years. His expertise includes American literature and culture, African American literature, and the intersection of faith and social thoughts. He says, quote, "I am both a disciple of Jesus Christ and a citizen of the United States, but clearly my discipleship to Jesus is my highest priority. So I want to live out my role as a citizen in ways that do not compromise my discipleship. In order to do that, I find that I need to think carefully about what is asked of me as a citizen." That's Carl. Yeah. And I am pleased to welcome back home, if I can say that, the Reverend Dr. John Faunistel, PhD. He is the author of American Heresy. He has some for you to take home if you would like to purchase one. Please do that. He is the executive director of Friends of International Friendship, an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. And for those of you who don't know John, he served as pastor of discipleship here at this church from 2015 to 2019. We just missed each other. Yeah, well, I'm not done yet. Hold on. He's got something to say. John argues a particular brand of English Protestant religiosity inspired the leading lights of the American Revolution to embrace noble values of which we as Americans are rightly proud. Values like order, destiny, progress, innovation, independence, and patriotism. But this same religiosity also tempted these same Americans to embrace practices like violence, nostalgia, racism, propaganda, conspiracy, and nationalism. These are the bitter fruit of white Christian nationalism, a pernicious and distinctly American strain of heretical Christian thought and practice that is, at present, in a season of renewed flowering. In case you wondered why we're doing this, he put it into words. And now, yes, now you welcome John. And are you officially doctor now? No, it's just candidate. You are, Jesus Ayala Candia is going to be defending his thesis, has already? And then my proposal. He's submitting his proposal. He's on the road, a doctoral student and researcher at UC San Diego. His research focuses on international migration and law and society. His work examines the relationship between state structures, agents, power, and policy, and his implications on social belonging. He states he's interested in this discussion because, quote, "questions of religion, power, and belonging are deeply connected to the same social forces that shape public life and national identity. Understanding how these relationships developed can help us reflect on the church and state's role in society today." This is Jesus. I have asked these three very brilliant people to say a little something about what they bring to the table, one after the other, and then to begin their conversation. So, Carl, would you like to open us?
Sure. Wow, it's hard to know where to stop and where to start here. Let me just give you a little personal history here. Born and raised in San Jose, the Bay Area, came to San Diego to attend Point Loma College at that point. Went off to graduate school, ended up at the University of Minnesota, where I did a master's and PhD in American Studies. One of my graduate professors was very, very interested in questions of national identity. And I really kind of inherited those set of questions. Later on, got interested in a research project, which kind of led me into greater depth of study. Even though my primary teaching has been in American literature, my research interest kind of varied widely, to say the least. But I came to a point of trying to talk to students about these issues and about their sense of who they were. I had the wonderful privilege of spending 34 of my 37 years as a college professor in Christian higher education. And that gets characterized in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. I can tell you what it came to mean to me. What it came to mean to me is that I was teaching at an institution that named a person as the center of the educational project, named Jesus and the ways of Jesus as the center of the educational project. That gave me a lot of freedom to talk with students then, because most of my students would have identified themselves as disciples of Jesus with some level of commitment. So it gave me an opportunity to try to get them to reflect on what were their obligations as disciples. And because I taught American content, it was natural then to ask, and how do those commitments kind of intersect with your citizenship? It was along, trying to think through these issues that I read the epistle to the Philippians with kind of fresh eyes, and came across this line where Paul writes that our citizenship is in heaven. And I thought, what an interesting use of the present tense. Because Paul did not surrender his Roman citizenship when he acknowledged that his citizenship was in heaven. His Roman citizenship was really important to him, as my American citizenship is important to me. But it meant that I had to think about how to negotiate that when I felt the tension between those two. And I think that Christians in America, I think, feel that tension at very different levels over very, very different issues. I think there are some Christians in America who can go through their whole lives and maybe rarely ever feel that tension. And there are other Americans who live constantly with that tension between how do I live out my commitment to the gospel and function as a citizen. So I explored then trying to talk about these issues in ways that didn't cause defenses to go up immediately, and to try to do it in such a way that's like, no, I'm not a disgruntled American. I love American culture. It'd be pretty crazy to spend my adult life studying American culture if I didn't love it. But I just want to live out the Lord's Prayer that we recite weekly in all its fullness. As it is in heaven, may it be on earth. So if my citizenship is in heaven now, what do I do in these moments when it feels like my obligation as a disciple is in tension? Real quickly, let me give you two things that have helped me. One is from a writer named Richard John Newhouse, who offers a really interesting definition of sacred and secular. He argues, a Catholic thinker, argued that for him the sacred was all that had to do with God's salvation work in history, and secular was all that is good, all that is for the present time, for the present moment. This allowed me to think of secular not as the kind of the term I had grown up with in Sunday school as worldly, that I am to kind of shun away what is worldly, but secular as a category that contained both good and bad. That there are some things that I will acknowledge as secular. In other words, they don't have much to do with the coming kingdom of Christ, but are still a really good thing. My go-to definition is democracy. I think democracy for the present moment is a really, really good thing. I'd like to see a lot more of it. But it is not, I mean, like one person, one vote, you know, that kind of democracy, right? But I don't think it's going to have a place to play in the coming kingdom. Like once Jesus comes to reign, we're not going to occasionally vote to see if we want to continue that, right? So that helps me. It's like, okay, now I understand what Newhouse is talking about, the sacred and the secular. The other is a scholar named Nicholas Guyat who talked about providentialism. And we all know kind of, even people who never go to church, understand that in America, private providentialism is kind of a big thing, because you come across people who will say some version of, I believe that everything that happens for a reason, right? There's that providentialism. For Christians, it's like, how do you read that verse in Romans that says, is it all things work together for good? Is it in all things God works together? Where do we land on that question? One of the things but then Guyat goes on to say that in addition to that level of providentialism, there has been, and there was especially in the English tradition, all the way back into the 1600s, when when they were forming colonies in the Western Hemisphere, the British believed deeply in a kind of a national providentialism, that God interacted with nations, with people groups. I think it's a good question whether or not we believe that. But Guyat said, and then he found in his study that there were three levels of that kind of providentialism. The one was judicial providentialism, that argued that God still judged people, groups of people, nations, based on their adherence to the ways of God. One level. The next level was what he called historical providentialism. And this was a belief that just as God raised up nations that we read about in the Hebrew Scripture in the Old Testament, so God raises up nations to do his will in history. Okay? On top of that, Guyat calls a form of apocalyptic providentialism. And if you grew up like I did in a church in the 1970s, you had a heavy dose of apocalyptic providentialism in the form of prophecy belief writers, who this level of providentialism, not only does God rise up nations to do his will, but that if you know how to read Scripture properly, you will find the key to which nations are being elevated, and which nations are being judged, and so forth. I've found that to be really helpful to clarify my thinking, because what I discovered is that a lot of times when we talk about whether or not the United States is a Christian nation, what role religion played in the United States, what role it continues to play, what we believe about providentialism is really key to where we might land. Because if you don't believe that God even works through nations any longer, you're not likely to believe that God is using the American nation, right? So those two things have helped me. The distinction between sacred and secular, and these levels of providential thought that Guyat argues are deeply woven into the American experience. because they were deeply woven into the British experience at the time that the British were founding colonies in the Western Hemisphere. I could go on a lot, but I'm going to stop there.
That is a lot for us to think about.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. John, you're next.
Thank you, and so nice to be with you all and to see so many familiar faces. Thanks for the invitation. And thanks for that, Carl. Providentialism, as I entirely agree, is a key concept for us all to struggle with as we seek to discern God's will for our lives, individuals, churches, nations, and to adhere to the conviction that God does indeed work through human beings, while also doing that with some semblance of humility and self-awareness. My parents, who some of you may have met, their favorite song out of the United Methodist hymnal was "This Is My Song." O God of all the nations, a song for peace, for lands afar and mine. That song is a patriotic song, but acknowledges that God is at work in all nations. And that's very much my belief. I ended up focusing on this topic and writing about it because I had gone back to school. Some of you may remember me sneaking off from my job here at First Church to take the train to USC, where I was finishing my PhD. I finished that PhD in 2017. I was already on staff here. I was 55. I was very relieved at the graduation ceremony at USC when the hooding ceremony, they call it for PhDs, very relieved that one of the very first people hooded was a guy who was clearly older than me. So I would not be known as the old guy in the graduating class. But I went back to school during that time, and this congregation helped make that possible, for which I'm very grateful, because I was trying to something I was struggling with for such a long time. It was precisely what Carl's talking about, this tension and commitment that I feel, and I think we all feel, between our commitments to things like our country and our commitments to Christ. I would say that tension is perennial, and it's never not a struggle for people of faith. So I think that's one of the things I've learned in my studies of history, is that we think of ourselves as living in particularly fractious times, and we face all kinds of challenges. And the more I study history, the more I conclude that, our ancestors faced very similar kinds of challenges and predicaments. So what I attempted to do in this book that I've written, and what I think I'll open with for you all today, is just this sense that this struggle is intrinsic to the American experiment. There's never been a time when faithful people in the early colonization of North America, and in the period of the American Revolution, and in the period of nation building, right on down, there's never been a time when faithful people weren't struggling with these kinds of questions. And my conviction is that to understand that struggle and to understand that tension is indispensable to understanding the very nature of the American experience, which is why I rebel against the temptation, and I rebel against the question, which is so poorly framed in my view, the question which is so much a current conversation, was America founded as a Christian nation? We'll hear that same question asked over and over again in coming months as we go into the 250th anniversary, and the Trump administration and others will play out on our national stage their answer to this question. Was the United States founded as a Christian nation? And I hate that question, or I believe it's an unhelpful question, because it fractures the debate and by inviting an either or, yes or no. And we split ourselves along ideological lines, with liberals, for the most part, tending to answer by wanting to answer no, and emphasizing the secular dimensions of the American experience, which leads to wanting to blanch out, the entire religious history of our nation. And suddenly the founders become enlightened, abstract intellectual thinkers, supposedly. Deists is the shorthand that people like to slap on them, as if that somehow they were escaping the Christian traditions in which they had been raised. On the other hand, the yes answer presumes a certain kind of Christianity, and it means that, today's contemporary conservative evangelical Christians are really the true inheritors of the founders, bequest, and that therefore the answer is yes, and that means that the founders were just earlier day versions of Billy Graham or James Dobson or whomever your favorite evangelical might be. My studies in history, it's very clear that both of those answers are utterly inadequate. To say yes or no to that question is not helpful at all, because the truth is that religion was a driving force in the early American experience. It was absolutely foundational and remains so to this day. But what most folks who study religion from the outside don't understand is something that those of us who practice religion internally, at least if we're honest with ourselves, we all know to be true, which is religion can be a powerful force for good, and it also can be a very, very powerful force for evil. That is in some respects, I think the human condition. We are all tempted, right? And my studies and attempts to put this into print, emphasize that this religious inheritance, which is ours as a nation, is the source of both blessing and curse. Blessing and curse. In my first book on martyrdom, I draw the analogy of a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways, this religious inheritance. And in this book on white Christian nationalism, I use the analogy of a tree with deep, deep roots that gives birth, or that bears both bitter and sweet fruit, both. So when I talk about the religious origins of the American experience, I'm emphasizing that these are powerful forces, deeply rooted in our national inheritance. And if we're honest with ourselves, we acknowledge that they can explain much of what is good about our national experiment, and also the shadow. They are the source of the shadow or dark side of our national inheritance. And what I've attempted to do in this book, each chapter is an exploration of this tension, how some of these early English Protestant understandings give rise to things of which we are rightly proud as Americans. The commitment to law and order is chapter 1. I don't know how many of you all, I have never lived, but I have traveled in a disorderly society. And if given the choice between an orderly society and a disorderly society, most human beings will choose an orderly society. Order is a good and noble thing to which we aspire. But in the American experience, that quest for order is also, and that Christian conception of order, the way man was understood to have been, commissioned by God to bring order, right, to subdue the earth, right, and bring order to it. That same impulse which birthed this noble aspiration to an orderly society also birthed the violence that we saw played out in the conquest of North America, the evacuation of native peoples from their lands, and eventually campaigns that amounted to something close to genocide. So this is more something that it defies the common conversation and we won't, unfortunately, in all likelihood, see it played out very well by the Trump administration, to be frank about it. They're not noted for their sophisticated history. The truth is that when we look at that as people of faith, we don't just see others on the other side of a ideological divide. Rather, we see ourselves in league with others who are all struggling with the same things. How do you live out your faith in a world and in a society and in a country that does not, sorry to disappoint Pete Hegseth, but is not, God's kingdom brought down on earth? So this tension and struggle, I think, is very human. I think it's very Christian, and I think it's very American. And in that regard, we're in good company because our ancestors likewise had to struggle with these kinds of things. And I'll cut to my conclusion just quickly, where I think it drives us, and I'll stop here and can pursue this further if you'd like, but where I think it drives us, if we're honest with ourselves, is into a posture and spirit of repentance, where we acknowledge our part in these things, both individually and collectively. We have failed God's call on us as individuals, as churches, as societies, and as nations, all of us together. And that when we adopt a posture of repentance and humility, we stand the best chance of receiving God's pardon and then being able to rise to the fullness of our stature as children of God. And we hold out the chance of living as best we can that challenge of being both American and Christian at the same time. So those are some thoughts board of studies which this church helped make possible, for which I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. You've given us a lot to think about as well. Very key. Thank you very much. Jesus, we'll wrap up the presentations with your words.
Well, it's not fair. How can I supposed to follow that?
You can.
Thank you again for this opportunity. My name is Jesus Ayala Candia. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of California, San Diego. I want to emphasize that my comments today, will come from my place as a sociologist, not as a congregant. I am not a religious scholar, so they will come as a sociologist, which is kind of ironic that I was left to the end because sociologists focus on one thing. We focus on outcomes. Everything that was said before me, I was looking at my notes and I'm like, yep, I wrote that. Yep, I wrote that down. I'm like, that trails, that checks. That's what I've been trained to do. So without boring you into a college seminar, just as I do with my own students, much of my training, at least to help contribute to this conversation, come from one of the most towering figures in sociology in general, and that is from the philosophy of Max Weber. He was a German sociologist. He was a very prominent scholar who unfortunately died way too early, just like any other great contemporaries like him. But he was one of the first sociologists, one of the first founding sociologists to actually probe religion and what that meant for the national structure of a country. In two major works, the first one that I want to just address some comments is what he calls the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And in this work, he's trying to respond very kindly to one of his other contemporaries, Karl Marx. Marx, again, very much viewed religion as just an outcome of economic relations, and he called it the opiate of the masses, and we can discuss why that interpretation is the way it is and how people have subversed it. But the point is, Weber says, yeah, sure, there must be something to religion as an opiate, but you are ignoring as to why do people keep going back to it. You're ignoring why are the structures that keep it alive. And regardless of how much you expose capitalism, why is it that people return to this opiate? So he got really interested in that. And Weber turns into the United States, and he looks at a very particular niche part of Protestant religion, and that's Calvinism. So for Calvinists, as we know, they had this doctrine of predestination, which it basically states that God already knew who was going to be saved and who wasn't. But you didn't know, whether you were going to be saved or not. And as he's trying to explore as to, well, what happens when these population is pressed with this psychological torture, that they don't know they're going to be saved or not, what's going to happen to them? Basically, he says that they develop this very strong work ethic, in the one they're going to try and find some form of solution, some form of guidance, something that he ends up calling a Beruf, which is a German word for calling, or translated as a task. In other words, that your own idea of work becomes a moral task, becomes a moral duty. Your self-discipline becomes your evidence of faith. Economic success can become interpreted as a possible sign of divinity or of divine favor. So this produces something that he calls asceticism, which basically meant also withdrawing yourself from these worldly pressures through monastic isolation or contemplation. But the Protestant version of asceticism becomes relocated discipline into every single aspect of everyday life. This can be seen through disciplined labor, self-monitoring, punctuality, frugality, rational planning, productivity. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Yeah? So here, the believer is supposed to expect to continuously regulate themselves before God. But Weber says that this will produce a very interesting paradox, and is that this ethic was not originally materialistic. Protestants, again, were not celebrating luxury or consumerism, as we would like to think in today's, right? They condemn this type of idleness, these excesses, these forms of indulgences. Wealth, in their eyes, was only acceptable insofar if it reflected a disciplined stewardship under God. So profit was supposed to be reinvested, not lavishly consumed. And what I'll point out very briefly is that Baver took time to read through some historical documents of the time, and he actually quotes Ben Franklin like at least 5 times to kind of undergird this idea of this work ethic and why is it that it's spreading. So this brings to a very major concept in sociology that comes out of this work, and that is Baver's idea of rationalization. Basically, he says that rationalization refers to the historical process by which social life becomes increasingly organized around efficiency, predictability, calculation, control, systemization, and more importantly, bureaucratic administration. So Protestant asceticism unintentionally helped accelerate this transformation. It is this religious discipline that gradually, he says, starts to spill outwards into economic and political institutions. Over time, labor becomes increasingly regulated, bureaucracies become expanded, so we can thank the Calvinists for the DMV. Accounting systems become developed, legal systems become formalized and much more structurized, and more importantly, institutions, just like religion, increasingly become valued for efficiency over tradition or their sacred meaning. This produces what Baver essentially calls the iron cage. Well, that's Tannhausen, which is a very long German word. But basically he says that this produces what should have been just like a cloak that somebody could just bestow upon them as a work ethic that was signaled by God, to an iron cage that is essentially trapping you to become only productive. So modern people, we inherit these ideas of labor discipline, of responding to bureaucracy, or instilling a bureaucratic system of organization, of economic compulsion regardless of personal belief. Which leads to my final comment here, one of Baver's points, which he calls that this produces a disenchantment of the world. Now, I'm not talking here about, kind of like Disney type of disenchantment processes, right? But disenchantment here does not simply mean the secularization or the loss of religion. It refers to the gradual stripping away of the mystery, the transcendence, the sacred ambiguity, and the cosmic meaning of the world. So the modern world increasingly becomes governed through these technical forms of reasoning, of bureaucratic logic, of scientific calculation, and administrative control. So what ironically Baver's trying to present here and through later works is that religion itself helps produce this process. So the Protestant ethic contributes to a world that becomes increasingly oriented towards mastery, towards discipline, and towards rational control. Modern individuals essentially become trapped within this iron cage, within these systems that prioritize efficiency and productivity over just asking these deeper meaning questions of life. And we see this, and he says through other essays, right, that this is a response that we start to see through other, what he calls spheres, that essentially religion becomes disenchanted, that religion begins to be pushed out as the center. We produce an ersatz, right, as a substitute. So he's responding back to Karl Marx. We produce not religion as an ersatz alone, but we also produce the political sphere as an ersatz to find meaning. We produce, for instance, what he calls the ascetic sphere, or this is what culture becomes. In other words, that artists, instead of just trying to draw inspiration from these deepened meanings, right, the church essentially says, no, you cannot go down that path because it becomes hedonism, right? Or in political terms, instead of producing brotherly love, you're supposed to foment control and individuality. So what I will close with that is that it is one of those classical sociological studies that has been critiqued, of course, right? Baver didn't have all the answers, and nor will I presume to say that he does, even though I love him so much. But I think it is a useful point of departure, because if there's something about the rationalization that he wrote, back in the early 1900s, it's something that we are seeing increasingly become. So yeah, how far is this iron cage, how rigid this iron cage is going to become is definitely a question that Weber has contributed for us to keep pondering. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I thought because we were on the other side of Calvinism, we escaped it all. Not so.
No.
I'm sure you guys have a lot of things to talk about as a result of hearing one another's ideas and perspectives.
Well, I wanted to just comment on how throughout our comments, and thanks for that wonderful exposition of Weber, and how many sociologists, both from outside of the country, outside of the United States, have been drawn to America specifically because of their interest in this relationship of religion and society. Famously de Tocqueville, right, who wrote Democracy in America, and his conclusion at root was that the United States was distinct from other nations precisely because of its religiosity. So it's so fascinating to me that outside observers are so quick and readily, it seems so obvious to outside observers that the United States is such a religious nation. And yet so many progressive, left-leaning, political figures would want to effectively wash their hands of religion altogether, as if it were a third rail that simply can't be touched. I really feel that's one of the great losses of recent generations is the public figures and elected officials who can articulate a progressive or a liberal platform while at the same time speaking to in an American vernacular that is inherently religious. So I'm back on one of my hobby horses, but I guess that's my prerogative. And just what I'm hearing across this is this, the religious character and or the religious expressions of the American experience have long fascinated observers because it's not it's not characteristic of many nations. This degree of religious, whatever you want to call it, sentiment with a professedly, non-sectarian form of government. Therein lies the tension, right? The separation of church and state does not wash religion out of the public sphere, and I think there's a lot to be gained by re-engaging religion in that way. And I think we lose out on the positive and powerful potential when we pretend to just wash our hands of it. So.
Jesus, the other thing that really strikes me as interesting, trying to think about the Protestant work ethic, is that a lot of American cultural historians would point to about a 30-year period between 1890 and 1920 where a significant transition takes place in America, where going into that time period, your place in the culture was very much rooted in what you contributed, what you did, what you offered, which was built out of your work. But with the rise of modern advertising, among other kind of forces, by the 1920s, there's another force in American life which says that your place in the culture is built on what you can afford to consume. And so you move from a producer economy to a consumer economy. And all this, and it's because you can't really understand the Protestant work ethic with something like what lifestyles of the rich and famous, like what in the world are we doing, right? We kind of worship consumption, which kind of blurs the line of like where'd the money come from, where'd the work come from. And so that's this major transition, which I think has an enduring kind of tension for us as Americans, like our focus on wealth and our kind of worship of wealth and the wealthy, and the inherited frugality, the inherited kind of sense of the work ethic and the frugality of it. The other thing that John, that there's an American historian named John Fea who's written a a book called Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? And I think he's as uncomfortable with the question as you are, because in classic historian kind of fashion, he says, it all depends. It depends, and here's what he said, it depends on what you mean by Christian, first of all, because if you grew up in a pietistic tradition, you became a Christian when you dedicated your life to Jesus, and nations don't do that. The other thing he said is it's really interesting where you date the founding. I mean, technically, this is, we're going to see it again, like we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, but that did not found us as a nation, right? The ratification of the Constitution founded us as a nation. The Declaration just says we're willing to go to war over this, okay? But even in, a historian pointed out just within the last couple of months that when Lincoln is giving the Gettysburg Address, and he says 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this nation, on this continent, a new nation, he's dating it to the Declaration. So there's that really interesting thing, and you point out in your book, and others have argued it too, that for a lot of Christians, they push it back even further to say, no, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, that's the founding. And that's first of all, it's 140 years before the Revolution, but that seems to be a really dominant kind of presence, especially in the lives of American Christians, to think about the American nation related to those Pilgrims and Puritans of the early 1600s. So that's, again, something that we are well served if we consider that question. When do we think about when America became America? And that's part of that national identity question as well, very much.
Yeah, historians always want to have it both ways, of course, and I count myself in that category. But
Preachers do too, by the way.
What's that?
Preachers do too. So
yeah,
just,
it's an easy transition. Yeah. There are different kinds of history. There's a kind of a professional or academic history which presumes complexity and argumentation, and that's how you do history, really, is you argue things out. And that's different from teaching history, especially in public institutions. I was listening to Jill Lepore, who some of you will be familiar with, and she was joking with another historian that, third grade teachers can't have an argument about history with their 8-year-olds. They have to teach history. Mm-hmm. So when we teach history, especially to children or our youth, it demands a narrative. You have to have a narrative. You have to have a story to tell. And stories get told by people with power, to put it bluntly. And so, it's natural and inevitable that there has emerged a dominant narrative of American history that has been taught across generations through public schools and churches that traces a very unilinear story from the, Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock to, whatever, the war in Iran, I guess is where they'd go next with it. Who knows? But, this presumption that there's this unilinear, providentially driven, destined for preordained or almost predestined, progress that is what America is all about. And of course, God is on our side in that. That's a very convenient narrative and a very comfortable narrative for many people. But it's not a comfortable narrative for a lot of us. Mm-hmm. And so then that begs the question and the challenge for us, as I think we've all been alluding to, is, where do we find a narrative that fits and where we can find our own, footing, that doesn't deny or pretend to wash out all of this history, but neither does it just take it as if we were still 8. Do you know what I mean? We're no longer 8-year-olds. Right. At least I don't see any 8-year-olds in the room. My granddaughter just turned 8, and I wouldn't try to have this conversation with her, right? Mm-hmm. She needs a different story. Children need a sense of purpose and a narrative about where they belong and fit in the world. Mm-hmm. But one might like to think that we can aspire to something a little more sophisticated.
What I like to pick up on your last point. It's an interesting point you raised about where do we draw the founding period from. This came from I'm blanking on the name. It's a documentary. It's on Netflix. I'll have to find it. And the narrator makes a very interesting quotation, kind of what you just mentioned, that if the 1776 period to the signature, the signing, of the Constitution is what started the nation-building process for the United States, it was the Civil War that identified the national identity. And that, according to the historians who are speaking here, he says that is the most profound moment for American history. And I don't know if it changed from what, the different ranges from what all of us were going through school, but I much more remember distinctly being drilled in the Civil War period than anything else before it. And I think that has a very important impact, for children growing up, through, if you're in public education, right, from early age all the way through high school, and what do they take with that value? Last semester I was teaching a class on race and politics, and it stunned me, how much, what I call heavy lifting I had to do from that historical period to just even discuss politics and why the subject matter of the entire course was going to matter. Because that gap was very much there. And of course, now we can blame COVID for that and the other sorts of reasons. But I worry about what that means going forward. I mean, for those of you who know me, I'm from Texas. And unless you put your head in the sand, you know that my home state is, yeah. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, it's a lot. But I worry, right? I have nieces who are there, right, who are going through the public education system there. And of course, I worry about what the content is starting to shift there. And other colleagues who are the other universities that I went to, that I was there as a student and eventually as an employee, right, how they have their hands tied to even teach these subjects that, yes, they are not easy to discuss. But now we're having a fracture as to what it means to even just be a citizen, not just an American, but just a citizen in general. Yeah.
We've silenced you all. No. So I want to come back to something, John, you had reminded us of, and I really appreciate. We've been in situations like this before, that history tends to repeat itself. I just wonder if there is anything in this moment where church and religion seem to be colliding so intimately in the halls of power. Is there anything in this moment that makes it different? And anybody can answer that, I suppose.
Yeah, the saying of historians is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Oh, I like that. Yes, yes.
So every moment is new, and yet there's nothing new under the sun, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. So the question would be, well, if this is a latest expression, or I use that language of renewed flowering of, this ancient assertion, I call it a heretical assertion, which is that the United States was uniquely ordained by God, not, to have the continent, right? And to subdue the continent and to have dominion, not just over the birds of the field, of the birds and the bees, but of their peoples, right? This presumption of American superiority. It is a nostalgic, again, that this movement of which many, I'm not alone by any stretch, that people shorthand as white Christian nationalism, is a conjuring of that tradition. I mean, it's nostalgia, 101. Yeah. It's the brand is nostalgic. Am I not right about that? Mm-hmm. So it's but it is doing so in a way. What would be unique would be it has all kinds of powerful new tools at its disposal, with mass communications technologies. It's a great question there, Trudy, and I'll stop there and see if somebody else wants to add on.
I do, I've become intrigued with the idea of nostalgia, because one of the definitions of nostalgia, I mean, the common definition is a longing for the past, which certainly resonates with Americans because, another definition of nostalgia is longing for home. Now, those two things together make sense to a lot of Americans because we have been a people that have moved a lot. And so a longing for the past is also a longing for the home, a longing for the place where your ancestors lived before they came to California, for example. But if we think about nostalgia as a longing for home, for me, that has a resonance with desiring the kingdom of God. Because there should be a particular kind of Christian nostalgia, which is filled with hope, which is a longing not for the past, but a longing for the future, a longing for a kingdom that has been inaugurated but is not yet present. And so that, to me, should be like, this should mark the Christian. This should mark the Christian life, a hopeful nostalgia for the coming kingdom. Which means then that my life in whatever society I'm in is a time of my kind of temporary residence as I wait for the coming kingdom. For me, this is why the letter of Jeremiah to the population taken into Babylonian captivity is so instructive for my politics. Because where Jeremiah writes, work for the shalom of the society where you are held captive. Work for the reign of God, the peace of God, in the society where you are held captive. It's like, what if I did that as an American citizen? Recognizing, number one, that this is not my home. This is not the home for which I deeply long. It's always going to be partial. It's secular, and I long for the sacred kingdom. But that does not mean that I disengage from my society. It means I engage in a certain particular way, knowing that this is a temporary residence. Which means that all political victories are temporary, all political defeats are temporary. Because in Christ, God has guaranteed the future. So what I so long for the church to do, and what I think the church loses the capacity to do if we too closely associate it with the nation, is to be able to stand independent of the nation in order to offer a prophetic word when a prophetic word is necessary. You see the problem? If I collapse the nation and the church into one entity and proclaim that God is with us, then how do I, from a prophetic tradition, how do I say a word of correction to the nation when the nation is not doing what God would have the nation do? To me, that's the sacred ground that the church needs to inhabit, is that place where they are free, because God is free, they are free to offer a prophetic word. If we embrace too fully the idea that America is has this providential role to play in God's plans for all of history, in God's plans even for salvation, first of all, we implicate God in a lot of really, really dangerous stuff that would just be completely counter to anything Jesus taught. The enslavement of other human beings, the eradication of an indigenous population, the suppression of women. Take your pick. None of this jives very well with the teachings of Jesus. If we don't kind of stand apart from that, then we'd lose the ability to offer that prophetic word. It also, I think, places the nation in the role of the church, as God's chosen community on earth. that's,
Yeah, it's a fine line.
I'm not a preacher, but if I were a preacher, that'd be my sermon.
There you go, there you go. Hey, I'm going on vacation soon, so there you go.
Trudy, I will actually let me chime back in on my mass communications technology and just say a word about how powerful, how much of a role that's playing in the current and moment. Not only on the side of people who have, the loudest megaphone, but also just in the way, our global society is being transformed. The big change that we saw down on the border, as many of you know, I've spent many years hanging around on the border, and the big change we saw on the border really was, the advent of the smartphone, 2012, 2013, 2014. And that was the period in time when all of a sudden large numbers of people were showing up on our border here in San Diego, and they were no longer running away from Border Patrol. They were running to Border Patrol. They were leaping the wall, getting onto U.S. territory, and basically flagging themselves to get picked up by U.S. authorities because they were intending to apply for asylum, hence the big movement towards asylum seeking across the last decade. And it took us a couple of years to figure out, but that was entirely driven by communications technologies. Basically, people had access to good information on their smartphones. And people were arriving at the border very well informed, both about how to access the asylum system, what was going to be required of them. And they were, these were global networks that were being lit up. And from that point on, last 10 years, I don't think I've ever met a migrant who didn't have a smartphone, to be honest. Smartphones are just like the rest of us. It has disrupted the world of global migration just as much as every other aspect of our lives. People are arriving knowing a lot. They're no longer caravans because it's, a WhatsApp group with 3,500 people on it, right? Sharing and pooling information. And so and my point here is just that the United States had the luxury, if you will, of being able to absorb large numbers of immigrants across generations. And most of us in this room would be able to trace our ancestry to people who came from other lands and came to the United States without facing too many barriers to admission. I'm generalizing about this gathering here, and I'm excluding all kinds of people, for instance, those trafficked in the slave trade and other forced migrations. But if our ancestors, arrived without profound barriers to entry, right? I mean, there are 110 million people displaced in the world, or 130 million, I think is 130 million displaced people in the world. The vast majority of those people meet our asylum criteria, to be honest. I mean, they just do. And yet our nation we don't have the capacity to admit 130 million people. But if we did, I think a good number of those would come to our doors, just as my ancestors fled, Russia, and many of your ancestors fled other parts of the world. So I think this, the United States is at a different place in its history where it's no longer able to absorb and admit the numbers of people who would desire to reside here. We've had our very powerful chapters in our national history of expelling migrants and rejecting others, but we're at a different place when the world is as full as it is and where people are as connected as they are. So it's a dangerous moment, I fear, because the desire to come to the United States is, again, people are not stupid, I've met, when I talk to migrants on the ground and ask them about their decision-making thought process, it's hard to argue with, The logic of it is almost always overwhelming. What they're facing and what they perceive as the opportunities that they might be able to attain here in the United States, right? These are rational decision-making people for the most part. And yet we're at a place in our nation's history where we don't have a means and a mechanism to incorporate those numbers.
It looked like both Jesus and Carl were about to say something.
The one nuance I will add to your comment is that, yes, one thing that I stressed to my students whenever I've taught migration is that the reality of the circumstances is that 9 times out of 10, people don't want to move. What we are experiencing in the current period, this comes from some of the work that I've done from Texas and some other projects on the side that I've done, the literature has consistently shown, right, that people want to stay where they live. What we're seeing in this contemporary moment, and I'm talking here in the last decade or so, is that we're seeing, one, much more family units moving together. Before you would, send usually, the dad to be the one to migrate, and then they will send money through remittances back to their home countries. Or maybe the eldest brother would migrate with the dad. But it was a very fractured system. What we're seeing now is a lot much more family units moving together. And it is because they do fill up into this categorizations of refugee and asylee designations, which they're two separate systems that work together, but they have to meet very specific criteria under the law, under international conventions, and under U.S. law. But what we're also seeing is that, one, COVID answered a big question that us sociologists of migration had. Can nation states truly close their borders? Because that was one of the biggest arguments that we had with the literature, that the borders were porous, no matter the levels of enforcement that we had, not just looking at the US case, right? We drew this from multiple cases outside of the United States. But COVID really showed us, right, that states do have the capacity to enforce their borders. And indeed, there was a rise in the literature in the mid-2000s that started shifting into this idea that everybody was just becoming more cosmopolitan. We were starting to label ourselves as citizens of the world, and what that meant for citizenship within this Republican view of citizenship. And here I'm talking Republican view at this political version, not the GOP Republican label, so make sure I make that distinction. But what we're also seeing through this process of nation states being able to shut down their borders, we're also seeing nation states communicate together to say, okay, if you know that caravan is making its way, what can we do to keep them in this third country before they arrive to the United States and ask for asylum here? This is a much more concerted approach that was not seen before in previous years, even when we had already passed these conventions for protections already in place.
You're good? All right. I want to just remind you, write down questions. I think I'm going to invite our staff to go around and kind of collect the questions you already have. We have about 20 minutes or so left to kind of, there's so much we could be talking about, and I really appreciate the overview from each of your perspectives that you have given to us. I wonder, what advice do you give to the normal, as if anybody's normal, everyday Christian in times like these?
Well, I've really appreciated Carl's, distinction of, citizenship and primacy of the claim, right? The primacy of commitment to Christ over the commitment to a nation. The same applies to the primacy of a commitment to Christ over, fill in the blank, over a racial category, over a cultural category, over a language expression, over on and on, right? So I think that ultimately it's the same struggle that we all have of having no idols before God, and that turns out to be a very challenging thing, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, so I think again, for me, it is part of being Christian. I'm not sure that we're all that different. We face the same challenges that Christians do in all places and all times in that regard. That's not a very satisfying answer to your question.
No, it is a helpful thing.
I would say, too, that recognize that American politics has a tendency to be apocalyptic. The idea that if this side doesn't win, all is lost. If that side wins, all is lost. And to try to maintain a hope rooted in Christ that allows us to engage in politics with a little lower temperature. That this is not the final battle. This is not Armageddon. These are political issues and we can do better. But to try to not treat our politics in such an apocalyptic way. That's
is
hard, though,
really
too.
helpful. Yeah, it's really, I appreciate the pinpointing of that in the way in which you've said that's kind of what we tend to do. I've been guilty,
Yeah.
right?
The other thing I'd say, Trudy, about in keeping with the theme of this, with which you advertise this seminar or this panel, and I gather what you're considering exploring in further study, Carl, is, the question of whiteness.
Sorry.
Whiteness, the conflation of the Christian faith and whiteness. Mm-hmm. And that's been a very patterned, another very American way of being is to, the category of whiteness as are all racial constructs, a culturally conditioned construct. And in American culture, there's been a somewhat convenient mechanism by which, people can become white. Some people can become white, right? When Italians started migrating here in large numbers in the late 19th, early 20th century, everybody was very clear that they were not white, but somehow their children and grandchildren became white mysteriously. And you get my point? Mm-hmm. So, and that again, and there's an incredible, just stunning piece in the New York Times this morning, an extended essay by a woman who explores her family history. Her grandfather and his brother were placed in an orphanage in Louisiana as small children. And one of the brothers migrated when he left the orphanage to Chicago and passed as white. And the other brother stayed in Louisiana as a black man and raised a... So it's the reconnecting of a family tree, one branch of which lived for the last 2 generations as a white family, and the other branch of which lived as a black family. Beautiful story, I highly recommend it. And like so many American stories, it has to do with the construction and embracing of an identity and a claiming of who we are in this place and time, right? We all need to do that. We need categories. Human beings need categories. We can't live without categories. But when the fancy word is reify, or when we harden our categories, and we take a constructed category, white, American, male, whatever the category is, when we harden those and attach those to our claims, our faith claims, we are in a perilous spiritual place. That is a bad, bad place to be if you're trying to follow Jesus. And so I think that's that temptation that, again, is part of the human condition, is to be self-aware enough that we can distinguish and identify those temptations in ourselves and release ourselves from some of those claims that others and powerful voices are always daily inviting us to make, right? Mm-hmm. What it means to be a Christian. Mm.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a lot of wonderful questions here. I'm going to start with this one, as it does address the whiteness. By the way, if only we had someone who had a thesis that talked about the white church and the way in which we forget to pay attention to the symbolism that are in our white churches. That was Reverend Dr. Brittany Hanlitz. Just in case, read the book. It's forthcoming. No pressure. Here's the question. Please discuss the idea that America is white, not multicultural, vis-a-vis Manifest Destiny, and they are diluting our blood. Can you speak to that?
Wow. Yeah. This is such an interesting question for me that I came to annually teaching a survey of American literature. It's like, do I present the early American nation as multicultural? Mm-hmm. And the promise has always been America as a multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy. Or do I present it as like an Anglo-American America that then started kind of opening its doors to other people? And my choice was always, because I think it's more historically accurate, to present the nation as at its beginnings, multicultural, multiracial. That being said, the power structures have historically been kind of Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon kind of power structures. And if you look even now at the American population and the ethnic racial breakdown there and the breakdown, let's say, in members of Congress, there's a incredibly wide disconnect. So there is one of the things that is certainly present in American culture today, among some on the far kind of racist right, is this replacement theory that somehow Jews and people of color are trying to replace white Americans. And I think that, again, to try to stress that even the colonial experience was multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial, because, goodness, I think at the time of the Revolution, 60% of the population of South Carolina was enslaved African Americans. 60% of the population. And if you went to the Pennsylvania colony, for example, you could easily live in the Pennsylvania colony speaking German. It's always been the case, depending on where you are in America, that you can have a complete, full American life without ever speaking English. That has been a historical reality in some place in America since our founding, I think, since before the founding. So I think just to try to stress, like, this is just demographically not who we've been. It's certainly not who we are. And if projections are work themselves out, we're going to be a white minority population by the middle of the 21st century, as a nation.
Yeah.
So it's just that just doesn't meet the data.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly where the question was intending me to go, but I'll put my early American historian hat on. And early American historians understand much better than even just a few generations ago how the early Americans became white. Because they weren't white when the English weren't white when they crossed the Atlantic. That construct didn't exist. The category of white as a racial identity was really fashioned in the North American setting and in relationship with native peoples and African slaves and the descendants of African slaves. It's in that interaction that European English and other Europeans began to first think of themselves as quote unquote white. So, and there's some, a remarkable book, just if for those of you who want to go deep on that, one example or one contribution to that scholarship is a book called Heathen by Heather Lynn Gum, or Gum Lynn, I can't remember which name is last. But she emphasized how the English, when they first came to North America, they had a category for native peoples which they called heathen, and that category presumed that they were simply uneducated, and that once they received the gospel that they could become good Christians, right? They were heathen. But when they didn't embrace the gospel, the first book printed in North America was the Narragansett Bible. It was the English who took the Bible and printed it in a native language because they literally thought that all they had to do was teach the native peoples to read, give them the Bible in their own language, and they would see the gospel and would embrace it because it was so obviously true. I mean, how much more obvious could one get? They had the truth in their possession. When the native peoples refused that generous gift and did not become Christians, they, over a generation or two, were recategorized as savage. So they went from heathen to savage, which is, as you can hear it, it's something less than human. A similar dynamic happened with African slaves, a very different dynamic, but a similar casting of native peoples and African slaves and their descendants into new racialized categories, white and black and so forth. So these are historically constructed in very particular ways, and yeah, if you're a historian or like reading history, there's great stuff out there on that topic.
I'm going to try and squeeze 3 more questions in. We'll see. It begins with the comment. During Obama's second term, there was an idea that America, as a white Christian nation, was in decline. Then we see how evangelical support led to Trump and his 2 presidential terms. The question is America a white Christian nation in decline? Was it?
Wow. It depends on what you mean by white and what you mean by decline.
There you go.
I don't know. That's the number sociologically. Can you help us?
Well, again, I don't collect any of that sort of data, but I think it was like 2 days ago, there was this article somewhat answering this type of question, right? It was religiosity on decline overall. And it addressed this whole point of white nationalism and the evangelical view on this topic. And what the data is currently being collected from the Pew Research Center basically says that religion is rising. Right, religiosity is rising across the board. There's some other, descriptive categories that basically says no, the data pretty much has remained stable over time. But one of the things that caught my attention was towards the end was that even though there is this push from the national polity to say that, yeah, we need to embrace this white nationalism worldview in America, or this white nationalism view of religion, right, the overarching support from the American populace is saying no. They're not liking it. They're not wanting it. And even when you stratify that through these religious groups, many have been felt left out because they think that the current administration, although it's branding this banner of white nationalism, is really only speaking to a very specific group. In other words, it's sidelining perhaps much of the other people that bought some of the political message and bought the idea to vote for the current administration, but now they're also felt that they're being left out. So that's as far as I will go with that.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a good article. Appreciate that. Here's another one. How do we start to explain the Christian church history to our children?
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, how about, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That works for me. I think this I mentioned that, repentance and the practices, I'm talking practices of humility, repentance, the acceptance of forgiveness, those are bodily and spiritually, things that we can pass on. Mm-hmm. So, if you practice those things, or and we all, the old joke about ask the monk, what they did every day in the monastery, and he said, oh well, we fall down and we get up, we fall down, we get up, we fall down, we get up. Mm-hmm. But I think we teach our children by our practices and our way of being as much as anything. And if we individually, as families, as churches, don't practice repentance and humility, we won't raise very good children. I'm not sure. Again, that's about as far as I can get.
Yeah. Be as truthful as you can.
Yeah.
One thing, too, I think, is that if we think about the Christian church as a community, pulled together by a common story, pulled together by a common understanding of truth, represented in the person of Jesus, we can contrast that with a society where there are different ways of thinking about the common good and different ways of calling us to the common good, which do not rely exclusively on an acknowledgement of the same truth. Does that make sense? So we're a community called together by Jesus, but we're functioning in a society where there are lots of other factions out there too, and we try to figure out a way to work closer, to get closer to the common good. But that the church is called to be a community that confesses a common narrative, a common story, and responds to the great command the great commandment, which is to love God and love neighbor.
And on the American side, I will also just say to hear multiple stories. Kids are very capable of hearing multiple stories and hearing, a multiplicity of perspectives. To hear an American story, that Jesus has a very American story, right? I have a very American story. Others of you have very different stories that are equally American, right? So I think kids are capable of more that we give them credit for sometimes in that regard.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm also mindful that young people can hear hard truths. And if you are afraid that your kids can't, it's probably because of the privilege we live in, because black and brown children have to be taught. I learned that from my colleague, right? My colleagues. They have to be taught the truth of the history so that they can function in the world, right? So it's part of that sharing and standing alongside, right?
Reverend,
This is-
Reverend, just if I may jump into that one last thing. One of the conversations that I have with my students when I teach race ethnicity, I frankly hate teaching that class because it's heavy to have someone like me in that classroom, right? And not face the accusations, oh, well, you're being biased. Let's just name it for what it is. When we get to the talk on privilege, I always make sure that I introduce that word just alone, privilege. And we go through the definition and what it's interpreted and blah, blah, blah. And then before I tell them, okay, well, let's talk about white privilege, I always make them do this little exercise. I tell them, okay, stand up. And they'll look at me, I'm like, you all heard me, stand up, right? And they stand up, I'm like, all right, sit back down, stand up again. I make that point to make them say, privilege is not just racial, right? And unfortunately, much of these conversations have been clasped in race. When if some of us don't have to worry about like, oh, I have to ask this leg to move the other, or should I take the elevator today because I don't want to meet my 10,000 steps, the summer body can wait. That's a point of privilege that sometimes we tend to obfuscate with the reality that many people have to live through or have to be taught to live through.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to give you a real hot button question, but it looks like we're out of time. Do it. Rather than Jeremiah's advice to serve the Babylonians when in their captivity, can we look to Jesus' teaching on love? For example, can we lean into loving Trump even though we disagree with much of what he says and the examples he sets? And I will ask, how, please?
Here's what, first of all, I think it's a strange moment. Well, not too strange. We're at a place as in a national kind of conversation where we almost see more enemies. We don't characterize enemies from outside the United States nearly as often as we seem to see our fellow citizens as enemies. Across the political spectrum, I think there's that language. But if we think that we're all coming out of a vision of the common good, we may not agree with how to get there, or may not even agree with what the common good is, but at least we're trying to get as citizens to the common good. One of the things that means is that you forcefully, in a democracy, you forcefully advocate for your vision of the common good. I hope without making your fellow citizens who are advocating for their vision of the common good your enemy. But here's where, again, the tension is like, okay, but my call as a Christian is to love. So that has to be in a different category altogether, with regardless of what kind of at the end of the day, whether my vision of the common good wins out over somebody else's vision of the common good, my call is to love, and I am not released from that call based on the behavior of the person who may disagree with me about something. I am not released to the call to love my neighbor. Nothing releases me from the call to love my neighbor.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. John, you're not poised?
Love is a many splendored thing.
There you go.
And there are lots of different ways to love. And love is not always, should not be conflated with acquiescence and submission. And loving Trump is a tall task, of course. That may be too much to ask, in the sense that one can't have a personal relationship with him in order to express the kind of love that I might like to think that he needs as a human being, right?
Yes.
I see a human being who I perceive to be in a great need of love, but love that would include some invitations to repentance and some accountability and some humility, and right?
Yep.
I think
Yep.
the spiritual qualities that are named, in the Gospels and in the epistles, I perceive a lack thereof. Let me put it that way. So can I love him? If he were living next door to me, I might aspire to love him in a particular way. I can't aspire to love him that way as my president. But I can aspire to love those who I identify with his politics. I can aspire to understand. I've tried to do that in this book, actually. The positive attributes that I name in this book are, again, things that I treasure and that I think we all aspire to. So to not assume the worst in others is, I think, hard when we're being invited. We're being invited constantly to demonize and to make enemies of those on the other side of the aisle. That's part of our challenge, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you all so very, very much for the conversation and the insight. This is not the end of the conversation. I want to share with you that we are going to have Carl offer an in-person class beginning May 31st, I believe that's the Sunday, from 10:30 to 11:30 here on campus. And so if you are able to be here, he's going to teach at least for 4 weeks. And if there is still enough energy and things to learn, we might continue and go further than that. In addition to that, if you cannot make it in person, we are crafting from the recording of this, as well as some recordings of interviews that the pastors have given with Carl. That videotape, those pieces of tape will be compiled into an online course that you can take and look at parts of it or the whole thing by yourself or with your small groups, your neighborhood groups, or with your family or friends. There will be ways for you to catch up with this conversation and others that have been happening as well. So watch your e-news for that information, and please take it. And we want to aspire to be those people who are able to understand where we are, where we have been, and where we want to go, and who we need to be as Christians. So thank you so much for being here today. Help me thank these guys.